Since its founding, Toronto's population has never ceased to grow. But after the Second World War, this growth was greatly accelerated. First, by the return of Canada's soldiers. Then, by the arrival into the country of over 100,000 refugees from war-torn Europe, followed by hundreds of thousands of immigrant workers and their families, who benefited from Ottawa's new liberal immigration policy, which mandated government officials to recruit workers abroad so to meet the incessant labor demands of Canada's fast-growing economy. By 1951, Toronto's metropolitan area was home to over 1 million residents, nearly 5 times its population at the beginning of the century. About 70% of these residents lived in single-family homes, whereas only 10% lived in apartments, the lowest number among North American cities of comparable size. The so-called City of Homes owed its designation to a variety of socioeconomic factors and municipal bylaws that privileged home ownership and lodging in private houses over the perceived unsavory lifestyle of tenement living. But Toronto's rapid growth forced its governments to consider new ways of meeting the urgent housing demands and better plan for the accelerating suburban sprawl. Enter the Municipality of Metropolitan Toronto. Established on January 1, 1954, this top-tiered regional government encompassed various local municipalities in the Greater Toronto Area and was made responsible for dealing with wholesale infrastructure matters like highways, public transit, water, and other aspects of urban development. In the first 10 years of Metro government, over 71,000 single-family homes were built in its region, most of them following the new standard of planned suburban developments, like that of Don Mills. Planned for a 2,100-acre area north of the city on the west side of the Don River, Don Mills was designed to be a complete town, consisting of 4 residential neighborhoods, cut into quarters by 2 intersecting roads. The new town was to accommodate an estimated 35,000 people in about 8,000 housing units. The award-winning design by the young planner Macklin Hancock included small-rise apartment buildings, neighborhood schools, office towers, an industrial fringe, and a shopping plaza. It would influence many other car-centric suburban developments in Metro Toronto. But if the city was to become the modern economic heartland that it aspired to be, it had to accommodate its rapidly growing population, which by the 70s had doubled to 2 million since the end of the war. The Metro government also had to find ways to decrease the costs of building and servicing its growing infrastructure, made more expensive by the increasing distances and lower population density of the suburban sprawl. The best way to go was up. In 1957, Toronto changed its zoning bylaws, which had prevented the construction of high-rise apartment buildings in most of the city. Now, developers were allowed to build them, provided that they followed the tower in the park style that was popular in Western Europe and the Soviet Union's post-war reconstruction. This would trigger a high-rise apartment building boom throughout the 1960s and 70s. By 1966, 40% of Toronto's existing housing stock and 77% of housing starts were apartment units, most of them rentals. Some of these high-rise developments were gigantic, like Flemington Park. Built on a 350-acre area south of Don Mills, Flemington Park was home to 21,000 residents when it was completed in 1961, becoming the most populated census tract in Canada. This title would be taken by St. Jamestown, an 18-tower complex built on a tight 32-acre area north of Cabbagetown, where 17,000 residents would live after it was concluded in 1967. These giants would not only reshape Toronto's skyline, but also its social and cultural geography, politics, and identity. Once the City of Homes, Toronto had become the high-rise building capital of Canada by the end of the 20th century, and was second only to New York City in all of North America. The construction industry soared throughout Canada, but especially in the Greater Toronto Area, where large amounts of private and public money were poured into residential, commercial, and infrastructural developments. By 1960, the construction industry's economic activity was valued at $6.9 billion, representing 19% of Canada's GDP. By 1972, that number would grow to $17 billion. Great personal fortunes were made during this period, which saw the rise of new, powerful urban developers and contractors, whose economic interests found an hospitable environment in the halls of the city, metro, and provincial governments, where business-friendly politicians were eager to solve Toronto's housing crisis, increase their property tax base, and enable the region's economic growth. The most successful builders inscribed their names in Toronto's skyline and at the top of its business food chain. Others came crashing down in this front-heavy, high-debt economic activity during a time when interest rates were high. In recent years, as these developers reached the end of their lives, tributes have poured in from the political and business communities, praising the vision, the risk-taking, and entrepreneurial spirit, and in many cases, the rags-to-riches stories of these dreamers. Never mentioned in these requiems is the fact that much of these fortunes were made on the backs of tens of thousands of immigrant construction workers who, for the most part, were brutally exploited in a then poorly regulated and sparsely unionized industry, which permanently disabled countless workers and claimed the lives of over 230 men, themselves risk-takers and industrious dreamers. In the 1960s, the overwhelming majority of construction workers in the residential sector were immigrants, mainly Italian. By the end of the 70s, over 495,000 Italian immigrants had arrived in Canada since the end of the war, about half of those coming in the 50s alone as bulk order migrant workers. Like their predecessors before the war, these migrant working men later called for their families, thus generating a mass migration chain that connected specific locations in Italy and Canada. The majority of them settled in Toronto's metropolitan area, where over 271,000 ethnic Italians lived by 1971. The majority of these workers came from impoverished rural regions in Italy, where formal education was limited, unemployment was high, and the future was bleak. The dream of one day owning land was a major motivation prompting rural Italians to make the journey to Canada, where jobs were plentiful and wages were good. They thought. For many, this was supposed to be a temporary sacrifice for the benefit of themselves and their families back home, where they hoped to return one day. With a sojourner mindset at first, these workers were willing to withstand short-term physical, mental, and emotional hardship, believing that this was the price to pay for securing a better life in their home countries. But with time, most of these temporary migrants would become long-term immigrants, whose return to an increasingly hazy home across the ocean was repeatedly postponed or forsaken, thanks to their new responsibilities towards their growing families and newfound desires and opportunities in the new country. By then, the dream of owning land had been replaced by a desire to own a home in Canada, where a house was seen not only as a measure of economic success, but also of rootedness, as well as a provider of financial income and security. These immigrants made the growth of Toronto's housing stock possible, both as construction workers and home buyers. But it would take decades before they moved in large numbers to the middle-class suburban houses or the downtown apartment units that they built. Either by necessity or by choice, these newcomers lived in highly concentrated working-class neighborhoods in West downtown Toronto, near their countrymen, who shared their languages and ways, pulled resources together, and built relatively self-reliant communities. Most of these men were familiar with hard manual labor and the seasonality of outdoor work, which many had known as farmers and fishermen. A substantial minority were skilled trade workers in their home countries, who either chose or were forced to abandon their occupations to look for better jobs in Toronto. Some had experience in the construction trades back home or in other European countries, where they had worked as migrant labor during the post-war reconstruction process, as was the case with Marino Tobin.
I come from the northeast part of Italy, known as Friuli region. The employment there was next to nothing. It was unemployment. All these people that came home from the war, they were all unemployed, and they were even the city started to help us to take training courses to learn how to work in construction. That's how I started to work, to learn the trade. I came in this country in 1955, right in the heart of winter. I found things not what I was expecting. Things were very hard. You couldn't find a job, not even if you pay for it. It took me about almost 3 months before I found a job. And eventually I found a job as a bricklayer because that was my trade. When I left Italy, it was totally the opposite of what I was imagining. I mean, I thought that everything was organized, there was nice and ordered discipline here. It was just like a jungle. I meet a certain group of people in a very early in the morning on a bus stop, and from there we've been picked up with a pickup truck and driven about another half hour somewhere northwest of Toronto. And there was a subdivision being in construction. You see only the holes, the excavator for the basements, and nothing else. Before we start working, we had to bring our own blocks, like one pass to the other in a chain type of thing, to bring all the block in. But then, when we start laying the blocks, in the meantime the laborers already prepared the mortar and everything, that's when we start getting paid, when we start laying the blocks. So the exercise before was just a warm-up. It was very, very difficult. Everything was different. The trowel, for instance, it was like a big shovel. I brought my own from Italy, and people started laughing at me. So the contractor gave me one. He had an extra one on the truck. It was like a shovel. So after a few hours, my pulse was swelling because that's how heavy it was. At the end of the day, I was told, frankly, you don't have to bother to come tomorrow morning. We don't need you. So I said, just give me a chance. I just started. So he let me go back for another few days, but eventually I let go. And I was paid 85 cents an hour, which is way below even the poor Italy was paying the bricklayers at the time. But it was very sad. It was very bad. Early in the morning, when it was still dark, you'll see groups of people in some intersection when there was a bus or a streetcar stop, or a gasoline station parking lot. They were standing there waiting for the pickup truck. The employer will come and pick them up, pick us up. It was like cattle. It wasn't, it was horrifying to see the way you have to climb up on the back of that pickup truck. It was just covered with Mickey Mouse plywood covered in the back. It was hardly protecting from the wind. But you had to climb on top of shovels, hoses, rubber boots, tanks of gasoline for the mixer. It was just on top of everything else. And then there was not even time to accommodate yourself properly, because once you climb up, the truck was flying away because they were late always. Not only the construction worker being picked up, but also women working in the farms. And that was just like a slave market. You see a bunch of women, young, not so young, all there waiting for the truck to come and pick them up. And they just look. If one wasn't really well built, strong for work, no, we don't need you, they said. Hundreds of people in the morning, all these Italian workers with a lunch bag under their arms, going knocking doors. Every time they see a construction job, please, you have a job for me? I said, no. So it was really pathetic. Casualties on constructions was almost a daily event, to the point that the Italian newspaper called Corriere Canadese, that started to publish in 1954, they wouldn't even put it in front page later on. Or did you see on page number 3 or 4, an Italian laborer killed on the job, or buried alive in a cave-in, or fell off a scaffold.
In the 50s and 60s, the residential construction sector was saturated by an oversupply of small and financially vulnerable contractors and subcontractors, whose often short existence was facilitated by unethical developers trying to increase their profits by creating a race to the bottom when it came to bidding for contracts. The relative ease by which workers became independent subcontractors contributed to the constant revolving of these small businesses trying to keep afloat. This perpetuated the sector's systemic underbidding and exploitative practices, including poverty-level wages, kickbacks, fraudulent checks, and a range of other abuses of little consequence to the perpetrators.
Any bricklayer was given, if he was had enough initiative or ambition, the builder will approach him and say, listen, you are a good bricklayer, you speak some English. Why you have to work for somebody else? I'll give you a few houses, you can start to work for me. So that got so many people fell for it because there was a catch. Yeah? Yes, I can give you a few houses to build, the brickwork or the blocks or the carpentry, but you have to do a price a little bit lower than your competitor. And then, when the time came to pay the man, and he give each one his own check with all the statement, the deduction, and everything. But when people take it to the bank or go to a grocery store, and the grocer had the misfortune of cashing that check, then he got stuck, and the next day say, hey, look, I've seen it. Hey, look, I got a surprise for you. Here's a check. And that was a vicious circle because you get paid by an NSF check, but before you find out that there's already a week gone by, contractors were just declare bankruptcy, and next week they'll change the name of the company, change the name on the truck, and back in business. To give you an idea how bad things were for the Italian immigrants, if a family couldn't pay the rent of the flat, the landlord would put the furniture right on the curb.
Unlike the residential sector, commercial and industrial construction was dominated by a handful of large companies organized as the Toronto Construction Association, which dealt exclusively with the British-dominated unions of the Building Trades Council.
The unions were not prepared to help this wave of immigrants that came especially from Italy, from over Europe. But they were fairly well organized already on the industrial and commercial sector of the constructions. It was like you walked into a different world there because they already had to use safety boots, they already had to wear safety hats. Talk about in the 50s. And the safety rules, the scaffold were all built according to the specification, and the working conditions were human, and the pay was good. Just look with envy at the beautiful industrial commercial buildings being built properly, and we were just looking outside with not even hope to get in there. There was the animosity against the Italian Catholics from the Anglo-Saxon part of the labor movement. It was very, very obvious for anybody to see. Like there was discrimination. Eventually, we had to impose ourselves. We said, no way, we want a union, and we proved that contrary to what they all think, that the Italians were not very militant in the union. They were ready to work as scabs. We were ready to accept any work, any job. Yes, doesn't matter how humble, how dangerous, how dirty it was, because we came here to work. But as far as being unionized, when we got to the point that we cannot take it anymore, Toronto was paralyzed in 1960. For 3 weeks, nothing moved in the construction site, in the residential field. And that was 99% of the strikers were all Italians. There was a lot of help from other people like Jerry Gallagher from Local 183, Charlie Irvine, who was the vice president of the International Plasterers Union, and many others. But it was us. Namely, one of them his name was Bruno Giannini.
Like many working-class immigrant boys growing up in what was then an economically depressed, staunchly conservative, aggressively anti-Catholic, and chauvinistic British Protestant city, Bruno Giannini had a rough upbringing, steeped in gang culture and petty crime. The son of a bricklayer who had migrated to Canada from Friuli in northeastern Italy, the 8-year-old Bruno, his mother, and 6 siblings joined his father in 1929, the year of the Wall Street crash. At the age of 12, Giannini was arrested for the first time, which he followed with 8 more charges for breaking and entering, theft, and vagrancy, before he was sent to a youth reformatory in Guelph in 1938. Giannini would accumulate other convictions for which he served multiple sentences that totaled nearly 5 years in jail, including the notorious Kingston Penitentiary. Despite his education in Toronto's rough street culture, Giannini had an appreciation for the lyricism of his Italian heritage and dreamed of becoming an opera singer in his homeland, for which he took singing lessons. At the Kingston Penitentiary, he was given to sing to his cellmates at night. Hoping to escape his hard lifestyle, Giannini left for Italy in 1949 to pursue his opera singing dreams in Genoa, although with little success. Upon his return to Toronto 2 years later, he decided to follow in his father's footsteps and became a bricklayer in residential construction. Here, he encountered the same exploitation as those Italian newcomers who were beginning to arrive in greater numbers. Once he had had enough of it, Giannini tried becoming a member of the Commercial Bricklayers Local 2, but only to find out that the workers' solidarity was reserved for the British. On October 21, 1955, Gerarda Trillo, an Italian immigrant woman married to a bricklayer, committed suicide in a Toronto police holding cell after being arrested for shoplifting at a downtown department store. This story was covered by the local press, which reported the husband's meager wages as the reason why the poor family resorted to stealing. Trillo's tragic death finally prompted Giannini and other Italian workers to act.
So imagine the humiliation, especially if you are here, but you know everybody in Italy are watching you, knowing that you're being caught shoplifting, you are in jail for such a trivial thing. So she ended up committing suicide. And that was one of the spark that really got us to say, wait a minute, things are no good here, we have to change. I was, like any other worker, looking for a job, and when I found a job, this man, Bruno Giannini, came on my job site, and he said, we have to do something, we have to get organized. I said, count me in. And the day I joined the union, and the day after I was going with him to put leaflets on other jobs. That's when I started my career in the labor movement. He was a very, very likable guy, very nice to talk. He had a very colorful vocabulary because he didn't speak Italian. He only spoke a Friuli dialect from Friuli mixed with English. But that was a plus for him, was an advantage because people liked the way he was talking. And he could talk on the stage. I was going from one job to the other. Everywhere there is a subdivision and see gangs of bricklayers working there, I will go there and preach the unionism and sign them up. If those want to pay, only we ask them to pay $1 to become member of the union. And then invite them to the nightly meeting on Brandon Avenue. The International Union of the Bricklayers, they realized that things were moving in Toronto, so they sent an international vice president from Washington. His name was Sam Sasso. And he came to our meeting of the bricklayers, and he spoke to us, very, very persuasive. I did the translation for him. And in the end, that's what he was proposing. Forget about getting your own union, because alone you don't go anywhere. Join us, he said. So he gave us the opportunity to have a charter of our own. It became the Bricklayers Union Local 40.
While they recognized Giannini's influence, the Washington-based international unions saw him as a nuisance. Except for the Vice President for Canada of the Operative Plasterers and Cement Masons International Union, Charles Irvine. Born in Glasgow, Scotland, Irvine immigrated to Canada with his parents the year he was born in 1907. An elementary school dropout, a former banana boat worker in the West Indies, and a plastering contractor, Irvine would climb the ranks of his plasterers' union until reaching its highest executive position for Canada. Unlike most other British Canadian unionists at the time, Irvine understood the risks to the labor movement in continuing to neglect the growing number of cheap, non-unionized immigrant workers in the construction industry. Irvine saw in Giannini and his Italian-Canadian union an opportunity to grow his influence in the booming residential sector. Irvine's fiery, combative tone and Giannini's streetwise charisma made a good impression on each other, and the duo would form a lasting, though sometimes rocky alliance that would forever transform Ontario's construction industry. In 1957, after a 5-day illegal strike, Irvine and Giannini organized the Plasterers Local 117 and Cement Finishers Local 117C, the latter led by Angelo Brigana. They secured a 40-hour work week, welfare benefits, and wage increases for its members, which they were able to extend to the whole province the following year after successfully calling the Ontario government to apply the Industrial Standard Act. Shortly after the Hogs Hollow tragedy, the Scottish and Italian duo decided to form an alliance of residential construction unions that could rival the Commercial Building Trades Council. For this, they brought together their union locals with the Bricklayer Helpers, organized by Giannini as the Laborers Local 811, led by George Petta, and also with the United Brotherhood of Carpenters Local 1190, led by Frank Colantonio.
Frank Colantonio was the most sincere, the most human organizer that I have met, and I had the privilege of working with him. He was an idealist. He was peaceful, even on the strikes. He wasn't inciting violence. He was always trying to calm down the two parts. He had a way and the passion to talk to these people. He kept talking and he convinced them. He didn't force people to join the union with threats or he would convince them. So we were teaming up every morning, go on the job site. I preached to the bricklayers, and he preached to the carpenter and to the laborers and anybody else that want to listen, invite them to the meeting. We start calling meeting on a place called the Italian-Canadian Recreation Club that was on 33 Brandon Avenue. We started to have meetings there every night, and the hall was getting full. We were called Brandon Union Group because of the meeting on the Brandon Avenue. But the main figure that time was Charlie Irvine. He was a real leader. He could transform the people to create the enthusiasm, the will to fight. And that's what he did. Between him and Bruno Giannini, regardless of anything else, we owe it to them if we were able to start getting unionized. Charlie Irvine, every time we had a meeting, he was carrying a shillelagh, which is a Scottish or some sort of a club that he used to hammer to chair the meeting. And one day, he's going around on the stage, he was all upset. He said, "What's wrong, Charlie? I can't find my shillelagh. You need the shillelagh to carry the meeting." So he looked on the back of the stage, there was a big box, a crate. He kicked it, and he pulled a big slab about 3 feet long. He pulled it out, and there were nails sticking out too. And the Telegram at that time put it on the front page, waving his club, and he said, "You don't build only houses with 2x4s. He was implying you can use it to club people. Frank Drey definitely had a role himself. He had his share of a role of getting the opinion of the Canadian people, the Anglo-Saxon people, changed. They start seeing the Italians in a different light. We weren't just but a bunch of scabs, a bunch of beggars. we came here to work and we wanted to work, but we wanted to be respected and treated like human beings. He was practically part of us. He will go on every job site with muddy shoes and everything. Finally, when we thought that the time was right, we call it a strike. All the bricklayers, all the construction workers, through ads in the paper, leaflets in the radio, phone calls, they were all there. Don't go to work today, come here. And we met at the Brandon Union Hall at first thing in the morning. I remember this fact, that the day that we started the first day of strike in 1960, there was a member that came with his little daughter in his arms. I guess just the mother didn't want to babysit or something, so he took her to the meeting. And Charlie Irvine asked his men to come, and he grabbed his child, put him in his arm, and he showed it to everybody, say, I've never seen any other community so attached to their children like the Italian community. They always send them nice, neatly dressed and everything. The fight that you are about to embark is not for you only, it's for them, for your children. And that got a roar of applauses. That's what the enthusiasm that we had at that time. And from there on, we start organizing flying squads. Anybody that had the car will take 2 or 3 people with him and give an assignment. Okay, you go on such and such an area. There's a subdivision there. If you see anybody working, try to stop them.
Thousands of predominantly Italian construction workers attended the Brandin Union Group's meetings since its founding on April 14, 1960, and especially after August 1st of that year, when it launched its first illegal strike. Over the next 20 days, large crowds of disgruntled immigrants gathered inside the smoke-filled and sweaty Brandin Hall to listen to their charismatic leaders. They then organized themselves into flying squads and traveled across Toronto's sprawling suburbs, stopping construction sites. Sometimes they were able to talk the workers into walking out. Other times, they pulled them by force. Irvine's aggressive tactics, which also included damaging sites and machinery, were able to stop 55 high-rise apartment building projects, worth an estimated $50 million. The pressure on the debt-ridden developers and their cash-strapped contractors was enormous, eventually forcing them to capitulate. In the end, a group of small and mid-sized contractors agreed to significant wage increases, a 40-hour work week, safety provisions for the transportation of workers, and union recognition. The Brandin Group unions also signed an estimated 6,000 new members during this strike. At a victory rally attended by 3,500 elated workers, these unionized men lifted their leaders in the air as a sign of appreciation, not only for their contractual gains, but above all, for finally commanding the respect of Canadian employers, unions, and everyone else. The labor movement's newfound respect for this landmark victory was confirmed by the invitation to the Brandin Group to march in their first Labor Day parade a few weeks later. The celebrations, however, were short-lived. Those contractors that had signed collective agreements with the Brandin Group soon found themselves excluded from the residential high-rise projects, as apartment developers hired the many non-unionized construction companies still available. Facing bankruptcy, many of the small contractors broke their agreements with the Brandin Group and went back to their previous exploitative ways, which their unemployed unionized workers begrudgingly accepted. On May 29, 1961, Irvine and Giannini called a meeting at the larger Lansdowne Theatre, attended by over 4,300 workers. The only way to confirm their previous gains, they decided, was to launch another, even larger, illegal strike. This time around, they counted on the support of 60 labor leaders from Washington and from the commercial and industrial unions of the Toronto Building Trades Council, including Jerry Gallagher's Laborers International Local 183, whose membership was increasingly Italian at this point. Their involvement effectively turned this into a near-general strike across Metro Toronto's construction industry, with work stoppages in the building of the subway, the airport, the Gardiner Expressway, the sewer system, and other industrial and commercial projects.
When we started, Charlie Irvine didn't grab a child in his arm and show it and see how nice we are to the children, how good family people. He grabbed a brick and threw it on the wooden floor, slammed floor. And he said, this is what the strike going to be. Prepare it to be hard-fought violence. That's how he incited. And he said, prepare for a long, long strike. It was a strike that you saw a lot of accidents, people going, throwing bricks, knocking walls down, destroying material. And even on the strikers' side, there were people coming home with a busted head. The striker will, when they end up in a subdivision, there were maybe 15 or 20 cars full of strikers. They go in there and they start shaking scaffold, pushing walls, turning upside down the mixer, everything was. And then move to another place. It was just like I don't know, like a thunder going by. There was a lot of violence too, unfortunately. But I think that was necessary. That was the only way you could convince those that were already working, they were still working, to abandon their job and join us.
Everybody wanted to strike, carpenter union, the labor union. But the carpenter, they went to work. And we strike, we go strike up and down the road. And we see those guys, they doing our job. I say to one of my boss, I say, like John Stefanini was there. I say, John, Giancarlo, what are we doing here? We got to do, we pick a line. Well, yeah, but those guys, look, they make fun of us. I say, they work, we don't bring nothing home. Those people bring bread home. When they got the raise like us. Maybe more. Yeah, you're right, but nothing you can do. If we can do nothing, why we don't go to work, I say. We got to do something about it. So I started to make a noise there. And I went to fight with the guy, you know. I don't know, I get a rock, I throw him a rock, I catch him on the head. But you know, he ran away. He went inside those portable washroom. Then I went there, he come out. I went close, I say, the guy said, this guy now we're going to beat. No, I say, I'm not scared of him. I say, okay, what do you want to do? No, if you go home, if you go away, I go home, but they go away from me. I go a little bit far, you go home, but that's it. I say, now it's a strike. I say, nobody work.
The bloody results of these battles were reported on the front pages of Toronto's dailies. As a result, public opinion, which had been unequivocally on the side of these immigrant workers the year before, was now more ambivalent about their demands and tactics. Ambivalent, too, were Irvine's views on the use of violence during the strike, for which he was often blamed. The police apparatus was also greater and more belligerent this time, resulting in nearly 200 arrests, many of them under dubious charges. On June 20 alone, 45 strikers were arrested in a subdivision in Etobicoke, including the future leader of the laborers' Local 183, John Stefanini.
I remember when Giancarlo Stefanini in 1961 went in jail. We start the fight there, you know, the strike, that's what you do. You fight here and there. Me and Giancarlo work together, close, you know, we talk. Giancarlo say something bad to the police, you know. And this police come, he run against him, because he ran against me. Like, I ran away, they catch me on my pocket, but I make to run away. Giancarlo, they pull me inside the truck. We got to take our brother, John Stefanini, out of the jail, you know, he was in jail. So what are we going to do? We're going to walk. This Bruno Giannini say, we don't have to be scared. Don't have to run. No, the police, if you run away, they catch you, they put them in jail. But if we stay together, 30,000 people, they don't put us in jail. We're going to walk. We're going to go there to the downtown jail. When we reach King and Dufferin, they stop us, say, okay, we're going to take them out. And Stefanini come out.
The police were definitely annoyed with us, mostly because maybe we screwed up their plan for their summer vacation. They weren't asked twice to arrest people. They were just grabbing and throwing them in the wagon and away. I was leading a big gang of strikers on the York Mills and Don Mills. There was a policeman, they were already waiting there for me. And the builders say, there he is, there's the shed disturber there. So the police, without any second thought, he just grabbed me and threw me on the back of his cruiser. And then he sat beside me, and the other police was driving, and he started using me as a punching bag. It wasn't very pleasant, I tell you. One contractor that I told them the night before, I thought I could reason with him because I knew him. And I said, Joe, don't go to work tomorrow. Well, you know, they come there and they may cause problems. He took it the wrong way. He took it like a threat. It wasn't a threat on my part. I was trying to, naive, to convince him not to go. He was there in the morning, and when he saw us coming, he had a shotgun ready. But the policemen were also there, and when the police saw them, he tried to, there was a big pile of sand, he pushed the gun cover inside the sand, tried to hide it, but the police saw it, and they took his shotgun, they took him, put him in jail. But that was the atmosphere that was then.
The developers were also better prepared this time around and mounted a public campaign against the unions, which initially drew the support of the progressive conservative government of Premier Leslie Frost. Intimidated by the union's show of strength, which had reportedly suspended the building of 20,000 houses in the first week of the strike alone, the Toronto Home Builders Association asked the federal Minister of Immigration, Ellen Fairclough, to deport those immigrants who had engaged in violence on the picket lines. The minister rejected the suggestion, which ultimately made public opinion turn against the builders and their threats. Prompted by the strike's quick and widespread escalation, Premier Frost offered the unions a peace plan that included launching a Royal Commission inquiry into the construction industry. Despite having agreed to end the labor dispute in a private meeting with the Premier, Irvine and the other leaders continued the strike for another month. To further press upon their leverage, the Brandin Group and the Building Trades Council called a 24-hour general strike on June 26 and held a solidarity rally at the CNE grandstand, attended by more than 17,000 workers and a list of prominent labor leaders. Frank Drea called it the greatest rank-and-file rally in the history of the Canadian labor movement. The strike dragged on for another 3 weeks after this, seriously straining the workers' livelihood and weakening their resolve. Many commercial workers started breaking rank and voted to return to their jobs against the wishes of its union leaders. Among them, Jerry Gallagher, who called for Local 183 members working in the subway construction to launch a solidarity strike. In an effort to regain the upper hand, Irvine traveled to Miami to meet with Jimmy Hoffa and was able to convince the infamous leader of the International Teamsters Union to order Toronto's Local 230 to stop its cement truck drivers from crossing the picket lines. They abided this directive until the developers filed injunctions against the illegal strikers. Then, suddenly, on July 15, Irvine and Giannini announced the end of the strike, much to everyone's surprise. Gathered in a so-called victory rally at Lansdowne Theatre, the workers reacted to the news with ambivalence. Their gains since Premier Frost's initial offer were not entirely clear, especially when considering the sacrifices that their families had made. After the initial hesitation, the 2,500 workers at the theatre finally erupted in cheers and carried Giannini and Irvine on their shoulders. After all, 1/3 of Metro Toronto's residential construction companies would sign collective contracts. Another positive outcome was the Ontario government's appointment of a Royal Commission on Labour Management Relations in the construction industry, led by the veteran labour lawyer and one-man Royal Commission, H. Carl Goldenberg. His report, released on March 26, 1962, confirmed the exploitation that immigrant workers endured in the residential sector and revealed in detail the industry's unlawful bid peddling, collusion, kickbacks, fraudulent paychecks, docked hours, lack of benefits, and disregard for workers' safety. Still, throughout the 60s and 70s, more than 100 workers would die in residential construction jobs, especially in the construction of high-rise apartment buildings, where newer and even less scrupulous contractors were to emerge, some of them Italian immigrants themselves. With these new players came new building techniques and materials, like drywall, concrete forming, and flying form. New trades emerged from these cost-cutting innovations, threatening the centrality of old skilled workers like plasterers, bricklayers, and lathers. The race to organize these new types of workers would pit old and new unions against each other, some of which tried to gain advantage by currying favor with contractors through sweetheart deals and by enforcing bidding rings. The Brandin Union Group would disintegrate in 1962, victim of the growing influence of new American business agents and their old extortionist labor tactics, and also to the ultimatums made by contractors during collective bargaining. This would lead to the departure of the bricklayers and carpenters locals. The high-rise construction boom became too literal a thing for Torontonians, who came to read with increasing regularity news stories about construction company offices and of job sites being destroyed by dynamite explosions, or about union leaders and rival contractors being shot at and beaten. The specter of organized crime would grow out of the shadows and into the public light in the residential sector of Metro Toronto's construction industry. It would take more deaths, more strikes, and more royal commissions before the jungle was cleared, and a new, more peaceful landscape grew in its place. The duo that started that process would see it through to the end, although not on the winning side of the labor battles that ensued, as we will learn in the next episode.